Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is the Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where should we go to first? We're going to go to an interview with Arty Green. He's a planner captain with a call sign of Arty Green, and he discusses with an interviewer the upcoming counteroffensive with reference to what took place in Kherson and Kharkiv. This is a fascinating interview. I suggest you go and watch it. I'm not going to go through it. It's really difficult. The subtitles come up at really inconsistent times, and I've tried recording it where I'm reading out the subtitles, and I just couldn't do it. There were too many mistakes. So I'm just going to give you a synopsis of like the first 11 minutes of this. Go and watch this, but it's fascinating. He's saying that essentially there are enough resources and forces to do this counteroffensive. And that's really interesting. So he says in some cases there's more than enough. He says, I'm not going to talk about ATACMs and F-16s, though we'll bracket those things off. We could really do with them. You know, F-16s would have strengthened us already, but, you know, we'll have to leave that for another day. But in terms of, you know, everything else, it appears that like the counteroffensive is in a really good position. And this is really interesting because this guy is brutally honest. I believe this guy probably more than anyone else. I've dipped into videos of his before with you, and they've been really revealing. Here he says, right, you know, we've got the forces, we've got the resources, job done, okay, but not job done. He says, I'm mainly worried about the standard of the operative commander, the standard of the commanders we have in place. And this is something General Zaluzhny said before in his interview on the Financial Times, which is, and actually Glenn Grant, the former British Army working now with the Ukrainians, that article I shared with you talking about all the ways that the Ukrainian army could improve. He talked about this as well, talking about how there were like almost two different armies or several different armies operating within the Ukrainian army. Depends who you speak to. There'll be some who have got like Soviet doctrine, some who've got NATO doctrine, some are poorly trained, well trained. There's a right mix. And this is kind of what Arty Green here is talking about. And he talks about how the Kherson and the Kharkiv offensives only achieve 5 to 10% of what they should have done. And he says there are two options here. Either they didn't continue attacking, or they didn't make these decisions because they thought they had insufficient forces to do so, or some other reason that only history will tell. Which sounds like he's saying that they didn't like go in for the killer. They had all the aces in their hands. He was saying, and yet they didn't go in. They didn't raise a bid to go in for the killer punch. And maybe, I don't know whether he's saying that there will be sort of pro-Russians within the Ukrainian forces that made those decisions or something. But he said it's one of those two things. He said that in Kharkiv it was a case of attacking where they were weak, and the success really came from the weakness of the Russians. And then they penetrated really deep, but they allowed the Russians to escape back across the Seversky Donetsk River, and they should have absolutely annihilated them. He said we took a lot of equipment, but it should have been an absolute ton more by the sounds of it, and that they were let off the hook there to some degree. In the Kherson area, they had the right amount of equipment and stuff, but they didn't make the right decisions. There are some claims that actually it was pretty badly executed, Kherson. It wasn't just that the Russians did a really good job of withdrawing. The Ukrainians lost quite a lot of troops in trying to penetrate in certain places in the bridgehead that the Russians still had on the western side of the Dnipro River. And anyway, he's pretty damning of the command that the Ukrainians had in both places, and said that really they were successes, but they were not victories. And there's so much more should have been done in both places. He was saying that from the 124th Tank Battalion, they were taking out a tank a week. So in 7 weeks, they took out 7 tanks, but they were being replaced at the same rate. And that basically there wasn't. I think he's saying there wasn't enough suppression of the enemy to then be able to exploit weaknesses and softening them up enough, so on and so forth. So he's really damning of the commands that's in place, and his main worry, it appears, is for the upcoming counteroffensive. Those problems still exist, and he's saying that in areas of Donetsk, they were still making the same mistakes that they were making in Kherson and elsewhere. So those lessons haven't been learnt. And I found that quite interesting. He is pretty damning of some of the Ukrainian command. Returning to Kherson, he said that they didn't breach the Russian forces at any point. They made a couple of gains, maybe in Snurivka and Davydibryd, but they didn't breach the Russians in encircle. In fact, the Russians just shortened their offensive line or their defensive lines repeatedly, just did an operational withdrawal and completely succeeded in doing that. So it was, yes, they were pushed out there, but it was because he says they hit the logistics with the HIMARS. It was HIMARS basically that enabled the success at Kherson. It wasn't so much the forces on the ground, and it appears that the forces on the ground didn't quite do, or maybe by a long way, didn't do what was hoped of them. I mean, he does say that they took the losses, the Russians, that they were, calling for replacements all the time. They had like intercepts and all sorts. That his unit took out 7 tanks in 7 weeks, and he said all the other units would have been doing the same. So there was a lot of equipment that was lost and troops that were lost, but still, it wasn't quite, the resounding success it should have been. In fact, I'll just read this. He says, I repeat, in 2 months, we took out 7 out of 9 tanks in one company of their first line, and I suspect the picture is similar for other units. And the loss rate was pretty similar for infantry thanks to radio intercepts. We knew how much of their troops we eliminated. Indirectly, we were hearing how much reinforcements they were requesting, how much of their expendable troops were coming. In some positions, their manpower loss replacement turnover was 2 times the strength. Their forward units in the most intense sectors replaced manpower volume twice during that time. So yes, we eliminated pretty much all of their enlisted soldiers and junior officer manpower from the 3 paratroopers divisions that were there, and 2, if I recall correctly, paratrooper brigades, elite motor rifle brigades. It's a 34th Brigade, if I'm correct, the mountain troops. And the 250th, these are Cossacks, at least in their honorary attribution, a strong brigade, a pretty strong brigade, he says. We managed to draw to the Western Bank the most combat effective elite and mobile forces. And in 2 months of intensive fire action, I repeat, not attack, but fire action, we eliminated practically the whole junior and enlisted manpower, 1.5 to 2 times. That is the main success. Not so much that we liberated Kherson and the western bank of the Dnipro, but the fact that we eliminated quite a large amount of their firepower. In Kharkiv, it wasn't so successful, which is really interesting because what we had heard before is that they took out a lot more equipment, particularly in the Kharkiv area. I guess a lot of Russians were able to escape and they'd left their equipment behind, and that's how they got a load of the equipment. Whereas Kherson, they were able to fire directly on the troops that were kind of locked into that Kherson area to the west of the river. But even then, he says, we should have absolutely annihilated them. They were still able to get an awful lot back across the river in their organised withdrawal. So it's like, yes, we did well. Yes, it was a success, but actually, it wasn't an annihilation. It wasn't the kind of success it should have been, given how kind of trapped they were there. And up in Kharkiv, they just didn't, continue on to do the job as thoroughly as they could have done. And it's interesting, he says, why wasn't the Oskil Bridge blown up to stop them retreating across it? And here he says, I suspect it was a decision from General Sursky, who's the general in Bakhmut. Now, I think he's kind of intimating that that wasn't a good decision, that maybe we didn't have enough forces to finish them off if we blocked them. But, he goes on to say that, or for some other reason, ultimately, we only got 5% of the benefit that we had already had pocketed. So, he's pretty damning of what the situation was in Kharkiv. He says that's bad. I'm here in the east seeing things up close, and I don't see that our operative commanders, brigade commanders, and above. So he's having a right go at senior command here. I don't know whether that includes Sursky. Again, as he's already mentioned him. And he says, I don't think they've learned anything from a year of war. This is absolutely scathing. Again, exactly repeating the attack attempts on non-suppressed enemy positions. And so he goes on. So I advise you to go and watch that. It is really interesting. It's a valuable insight into what just one guy thinks, and you can dismiss that as anecdotal, but it does jive with what other people have been saying as well, of the present situation. Looking at the whole of the armed forces, the whole of the army in Ukraine, it is a bit of a patchwork. This was the Arty Green interview, and how I found out about it from Andrew Perpetua. The topics he talks about are the counteroffensive prospects, risks, and opportunities, comparison to Kharkiv and Kherson offensives, critical improvement points at operative level command. So he goes on to talk about how to improve resource level, either swift victory or long stalemate, munition consumption and allocation unbalance, Russian grand winter offensive goal, it's not what one might think, and the Battle of Bakhmut status and criticality. I will actually, and then main military tasks before Ukraine in the upcoming offensive. So I will just summarize that in a future video for you. Probably my next video, I'm going to go through that and just note down the summary points to that. As this guy says, insightful, depressing to hear what went down at Kherson. A lot of us suspected as much. Don't really know what is wrong with some of these UA commanders and generals still at this stage of the war. Half of them should have been sacked by now and replaced with competent field officers. And someone else says, I would take this with a big pinch of salt. One of his arguments is nonsense. He says, I've read the source is extremely dubious. There's going to be kickback against this source, of course. There'll be, this is not good for Ukrainian PR, so there'll be some kickback against that, undoubtedly. Okay, let's go on to something a little bit different. Samuel Bendet here, a quick thread. He's an expert on autonomous and robotic military systems and artificial intelligence. Quick thread on the unnecessary time-wasting, OPSEC violating, and even dangerous things some Russian military commanders are still doing on the front, from a pro-Kremlin Telegram channel. Main points below. So all the criticisms against Ukrainians, remember the Russians are operating at a level that is well below that. From all of the information I can see. Now, don't think that they are a completely non-learning organization. I think General Mick Ryan just did a thread talking about how, they have been learning. Don't think they're completely devoid of the capacity to adapt in this war. They have been able to do that, but there's also just a trove of information on where they're falling far short. Here, this is from a Russian Telegram channel. Quote, a lack of combat training in the rear. And I did mention this yesterday. In some units not involved in direct combat, the old approach to training personnel is retained. Basically, just writing notes and papers. Even officers who are supposed to train contractors in fires and special training only do so on paper. Inspections. In one unit, the fighters were forced to prepare their uniforms for the official photo op and review by sewing their tags on personal property. In some rear units, the inspectors were not interested in the quality of combat training in general and are preoccupied with drill exercises, the composition of knapsacks, and keeping registers and notebooks. Checkpoints and uniforms. At some border points, military personnel were to be allowed through only in an authorized uniform. Later, this idea was abandoned. In some places, they are still trying to prohibit the wearing of uniforms bought with soldiers' own money. Fighters get reprimanded for failure to comply with orders. Reporting and command and control. In some artillery units at the front, the system of reports and approval of targets was resumed through the good old slide decks. The cartoons for command must contain tactical signs as well as real photo confirming the enemy location. There are no working communication means for the prompt transmission of information and a timely strike. The software regulated by the MOD does not function. Sending data is possible only through instant messengers, which are officially prohibited. This is something we've heard previously. The idea that the information getting from A to B is much slower the Russian side, and so they are far less reactive. Counter battery fire is a sort of good example of this. They can't get that information to the right people in a way that means that objectives can be struck in a timely manner. In addition, there are instructions at the front line to seize, quote, all comms terminals and advanced multimedia capabilities. The fighters are offered only a push button telephone to communicate with relatives, despite the fact that there is simply no alternative equipment with the most common SIM or telephone cards. Awards. Some commanders are guided by an unspoken rule. A fighter cannot receive an award if he has already been awarded a medal over the past 3 years. And it doesn't matter whether a person deserves a promotion or not. Medals are either given away to others, sometimes completely unrelated to the combat mission, or replaced by less significant awards. A certain category of commanders and chiefs is divorced from reality and is guided only by normative acts, most of which have become obsolete or are not applicable to current conditions. Commanders' tyranny can sometimes results in checking the availability of pencils among soldiers, the presence of whistles and field bags, and demands to shave off beards. There are also good examples out there. In one unit, the command heeded the voice of reason and abandoned the idea of recording each quadcopter flight in a special log. However, this does not happen everywhere. The principle of, quote, finding a job for a subordinate so that he doesn't mess around is completely inapplicable. Setting stupid tasks only help the enemy, seriously reducing the fighters' morale, psychological state, and their combat readiness. There's actually a graphic made by Rebar summarizing all of this. So, this is accepted by as pro-Russian sources as Rebar here. Things are not good in a lot of these units, but then Russia seemed to have just been getting away with the approach of just having more people than the enemy, and that's how they gain where they do gain. Yeah. Trentelenko, going on to something else here. Trentelenko says, for me, the lack of self-recover vehicles or self-recovered cables, or chains on Russian armored fighting vehicles never ceases to amaze. This sort of thing is downstream from the lack of the Russian armed forces NCOs and the destruction of Russian training cadre in April, May, June 2022. So this is something that's really, you would think is obvious. This is a really little thing, but actually it's quite meaningful. And he looks at things like this and the video here, which comes from Tendar. Well, it doesn't come from him. He's posted it. 2 Russian vehicles got stuck in the mud and were abandoned by the crew. BMP-3 on the right and a possible 2S9 Nonna S on the left. Always amazes me that Russian soldiers frequently leave their vehicles intact without disabling it for the enemy and then run. So there are 2 points to be made here, which is from both of them. So Tendar's point is that, and this is doctrine in NATO forces, that if you abandon your vehicle, you chuck your hand grenades in there and you blow it up. That isn't going to be used by the enemy. Here we have 2 vehicles that have been stuck because they don't have armored recovery vehicles or chains on board to be able to pull them out. They just don't have simple things like that. So one, they're not destroyed, and 2, they were just stuck in the first place. So and not recovered. And you're basically just saying to the Ukrainians, here's a couple of vehicles. Go on, take them. There have been conspiratorial theories that sometimes the Russians abandon their vehicles so that the Ukrainians get them. And they're kind of like, we don't want to be here. We want this war to end. That kind of approach. But I don't know if that's just kind of just rumor, if there's any truth behind that. But again, Trentelenko rightfully gets amazed that there are just no recovery. There is no recovery of Russian vehicles as far as we've seen, or hardly any. Okay, going on to something else here. This is from Euromaidan Press that has one regiment showing wooden planks as a structural element of Russian armor. This is a T-80 tank, apparently, the wreckage of a T-80 tank, and it is literally been fixed up with wooden planks. It's just absolutely incredible. Although, having said that, it appears that the wooden planks are the only bits that are left, so maybe that's a good thing. Yeah, wooden planks used where you would expect there to be metal. And this, again, what does this tell you? It's the little things. What does that tell you? They have wood, but they don't have the metal. Fascinating. Now, here we have a captured T-62 tank that is looked around by, and this is this is a 15.5-minute video where you can see him sort of looking around this tank that is, not in a great way. Obviously, it's been pretty much, yeah, it's seen better days, of course. And he goes, looks around it, looks at the condition of everything and how absolutely terrible it is inside. Just some really really outdated stuff in really poor condition. And yeah, really, really ancient looking tank with, and we'll talk about those optics in a second. Just some rusty bucket of metal. Yeah, fascinating. Anyway, it's a massively long video, that tour. Some conversation about that. A good look into the limited optics available to the commander: single tube, day and night sights, and small periscopes. In general, the interior is, for a lack of a better term, crusty. Yeah. How representative is this tank of the tanks the Russians have? Well, it is a T-62, a T-62M that they are using. Yes, they have got these out of retirement, but you can see that these aren't going to give you much of a competitive advantage over the tanks that you're facing. And goodness me, imagine pretty much living in this hunk of junk. Yeah, in a pretty bad way. And as we saw in the other one, even fixed up with wood. Right, this is something completely different. Just a random assortment of stuff today. Sorry, there's not too much of a thread going in the stuff I'm delivering to you. But here we have a video. And I'm just absolutely amazed. I would not want to be driving. I know that they've been probably deactivated or switched off or whatever, but I just wouldn't want to be traveling over a really rough field in the back of a Scooby-Doo van almost with with that many mines just sitting on those mines. Just like, even if you told me, yeah, they definitely won't go off. Like, I know how mines work; they won't go off. I wouldn't be like, yeah, it's all right. I'll just sit on the mines then for this journey. I just wouldn't want to do it. Anyway, horses for courses, each their own. He obviously enjoyed it and he's lived to fight another day. So by the looks of it, this is a thread from Tatarigami on, and he said he would talk about this on a new PMC, private military company, new mercenary group. So my thread, in my recent thread, I discussed a new PMC and promised to provide more information when possible. This group is known as the Wolves, and it is involved in an assault, scouting, and sabotage missions. But their story is more complex than that. Rather than gaining notoriety for their effectiveness, the Wolves have become the center of a brewing scandal. Hundreds of soldiers mobilized by the Ministry of Defense last year unexpectedly found themselves as members of the PMC, which they had no prior knowledge. In a video published by the Telegram channel Astra, dissatisfied soldiers from military bases, and he names a couple of them, claimed that they were misled into moving from the Sotayalie Dvory training ground in the Kursk region to the city of Rostov. Upon arrival, their IDs were taken. After that, the soldiers claimed that they ended up at an unknown location in Luhansk, leaving them with no knowledge of their current whereabouts or the names of their direct and indirect commanders. Some groups are being pressured to sign a contract with the PMC Wolves. Satellite imagery of the training ground where the soldiers were initially stationed confirms that the camp can house hundreds of people at the same time, and it appears to be in use. The Wagner linked Telegram channel claims that the mobilized soldiers have voluntarily joined the PMC and are currently serving under Wagner's command. This claim is false, as most soldiers refuse to sign contracts with the PMC. Recently, I became aware that recovering soldiers in hospitals are sometimes being transferred to PMC or even assault units instead of returning to their original units. I'm unsure of how widespread this trend is, but it appears to be increasing. It appears that wolves are being trained by experienced Wagner instructors who have recently returned from the front lines. Additionally, it appears that some of the training for these soldiers is taking place at Wagner facilities. Last week, the core unit of the wolves, likely composed of more experienced Wagner soldiers, participated in operations around Bakhmut and suffered casualties. The wolves have a company-sized force that will soon be reinforced by the mobilized soldiers previously mentioned. But the purpose behind PMC Wagner's creation of a new daughter PMC that mirrors them remains unclear. It seems that the Wolves may function as a cover unit for Wagner, made up of MOD soldiers who were transferred without their knowledge, but this is still speculative. Kindly ensure to like, share, and follow, etc., etc. Yes, who knows what is going on here and why Wagner would want to do this, but it seems fairly underhand. It seems like the Russian soldiers were not aware of this. If that can be trusted, that can be trusted, and that, obviously that's not, it's not a good sign. It's not a sign of a fully functioning military if you're having to do things like that. Right. Final thing I'm going to come to today is the part 6 of Chris O. Wiki, his Crimea History and Geography series. This is the 6th and final installment. He's an independent military history author and researcher. Yeah, we've been through previous installments that have looked at the initial kind of geography of Crimea, the earlier history going through the centuries, and then up to the 20th century, where there were a number of different invasions of Crimea in the First World War era, and then Second World War era, both the Nazis taking Crimea and then holding it with the Romanians, and then the Soviets taking it back in 43 and 44. 1943 and 1944. So now we're going to come on to the final part. Russia's seizure of Crimea in 2014 was more a coup de main. Its troops were already present in military bases leased from Ukraine and was not accompanied by any significant bloodshed. However, a Ukrainian attempt to retake Crimea by force will face many difficulties. As I highlighted in the first thread, Crimea's geography makes it a difficult place to invade. There are only 3 narrow land routes into the peninsula. 2 of them, the Chonhar Peninsula, that's there, and the Arabat Spit, are reliant on bridges, while the third is a narrow isthmus. So this is a narrow piece of land that does connect the mainland Ukraine to Crimea. The other 2 are connected now by bridges. All of these invasion routes, plus the Sivash salt lagoons, these lagoons here that are half a meter to a meter at low tide, but then high tide, obviously a little bit deeper, have been used at various times, but they also present major difficulties. The Perekop Isthmus is narrow. That's the one to the northwest. The Perekop Isthmus is narrow, flat, lacks any natural cover, and has been heavily fortified for centuries. So there's ditches, walls, and whatnot. The bridges from the Chonhar Peninsula can easily be demolished, and the narrow peninsula, as well as the opposite shore, is still studded with World War II fortifications. The area is also completely flat and lacks any cover. The bridge at the Arabat Spit can also be demolished easily. There is no proper road along the spit, which is only 270 meters or 885 feet wide at one point. Again, it's flat and completely exposed and is particularly vulnerable to naval or air attack from the Sea of Azov. The Sivash is in most places too shallow for conventional boats, too wide to swim, and too deep or too muddy to wade. It's possible to cross in certain places, but only at certain times and on foot without heavy equipment, any concealment or any cover from air attack. Russia is clearly well aware of these defensive advantages and has made systematic efforts to refortify these areas. New fortifications are visible in satellite images and have been mapped. And of course, Brady Afric has been doing that. In fact, this is his map coming up. Notably, the Russians appear to be refortifying the traditional invasion routes along the Perekop Isthmus and Chonhar Peninsula, as well as building a line of fortifications behind the entire northern Crimean coastline, presumably to block any crossings from the Sivash. The experience of World War II, in particular the Axis invasion of Crimea in 1941 to 1942 and the Soviet reconquest of 1943 to 44, is highly relevant to the current situation, although there are some very important differences that are worth highlighting. The Russians are now likely in a stronger defensive position in Crimea than the Soviets were in 1941 or the Axis were in 1943. The Ukrainians are certainly far weaker compared to their opponents than the invading Wehrmacht was in 1941 or the Red Army was in 1943 to 44. The 1941 to 42 invasion was accomplished without air or naval superiority. The Germans were able to breach the deep Soviet defenses at Perekop and Ishun due to strong artillery and engineering support, well-trained and experienced troops, and effective combined arms tactics. They also had much better leadership than the Soviets, and the Red Army's Crimean force suffered from poor morale and ethnic discontent, particularly among non-ethnic Russian soldiers, that the Germans successfully exploited. The 1943 to 1944 invasion did take place with Soviet air and naval superiority, although that wasn't used very effectively anywhere other than Perekop, where Soviet aircraft devastated the defending Axis forces and a Soviet amphibious landing forced the Axis into retreat. Notably, the Germans were unable to prevent the Soviets crossing the Kerch Strait to invade Crimea from the east. An important lesson for the present day. Even if Ukraine was able to retake Crimea, it would face a constant threat of Russian invasion from across the strait. So just to give you an idea of where that is, so the Kerch Strait is that area there. So if the Ukrainians could take back Crimea, then there would still be this threat of an attack of the Russians from across here. But of course, that's always going to be the case, right? That's something they'll forever have to contend with. In both invasions, once the peripheral defenses were overcome, the invading forces were able to very rapidly advance across Crimea. The peninsula's flat, arid interior has few defensible places other than Sevastopol, the southern mountains, and the Akhmonai line in the east. So there, southern mountains and Sevastopol. Otherwise, the rest of Crimea is very flat and doesn't have any natural sort of barriers or defensive features. Russia's defensive plan for Crimea is clearly to block the Ukrainians in the far north of the peninsula, keeping them well away from the vulnerable interior. The new fortifications already appear to be more extensive than those installed by the Soviets or the Axis in World War II. Crimea can be resupplied by multiple land and sea routes. The parts of Yevpatoria, Sevastopol, Yalta, Feodosia, and Kerch can all be used for resupply, and the Kerch Bridge provides high-volume rail and road fixed links to Russia. So there are many ports. It will be a really tough nut to crack for the Ukrainians to take head-on. In 1943 to 44, the Germans used merchant shipping and landing craft that were originally built but never used for the invasion of Britain to cross the Kerch Strait, resupply Crimea, and evacuate their forces. Neither the Germans nor Soviets were able to interdict the sea routes. Ukraine is very unlikely to be able to blockade Crimea's ports. It has no significant naval capability to counter the Russian Black Sea Fleet and no naval presence at all in the Sea of Azov. The modern Black Sea Fleet is more powerful than its 1940s equivalent. Port installations can certainly be struck with long-range missiles, but World War II demonstrated that ports like Cherbourg in the picture below can remain operational even after suffering heavy damage from massive aerial bombardment, shelling, and sabotage. While Ukraine did succeed in severely damaging the Kerch Bridge in 2022, that has now been repaired and the same method of attack is unlikely to be repeatable. It does not have the means to attack the bridge by air or with long-range artillery. The oft-mentioned ATACMS missile is unlikely to be effective in destroying the bridge due to its relatively small warhead, 160 to 560 kilograms. US experience suggests that large 1,000 to 2,000 pound guided bombs would be needed. And he's talked about this in a previous thread. Crimea's internal lines of communication are far better now than they were in the 1940s. It has the same railway lines, but its principal roads are now more modern asphalt highways and no longer the dirt tracks that caused so many problems for earlier armies. Amphibious landings appear to be impossible. Ukraine reportedly only has one large landing craft, and such an effort would be suicidal without naval or air support. Russia has also been fortifying the coast against any conceivable amphibious attacks. Ukraine's air power is far less than that of Russia, which has many air bases in Crimea. Neither side currently has air superiority due to the strength of their respective anti-aircraft defenses, though Ukraine's defenses may be more fragile than Russia's. Ukraine's options for retaking Crimea by force appear to be much the same as the Germans in 1941, a combined arms frontal attack by Perekop, with heavy artillery, assault troops and combat engineers clearing the obstacles. However, the German experience showed that heavy casualties would be very likely with such an approach. They suffered 12,000 casualties in the battle for Perekop and Ishun. Modern weapons would likely inflict an even heavier toll on an attacker. It's also worth noting that the German victory at Perekop in 1941 was quite a close run thing. The Soviets put up strong resistance despite their disadvantages and could conceivably have held off the Germans if they had been better led. The Russians would certainly resist more strongly than the Soviets did in 1941 when they were weakened by months of gigantic defeats and retreats. The Soviets viewed Crimea and its hero city of Sevastopol as being sanctified by the 700,000 casualties they suffered there. Even today, Crimea's soil conceals uncounted numbers of Russian war dead. As recently as 2018, a previously unknown mass grave of Red Army soldiers was discovered at the Tatar ditch near Perekop, where they had been hidden in the 1st of November 1944 assault on the Axis defences. Modern Russia has fetishized World War II, including the 1944 reconquest of Crimea, as a central element of Putin's nationalist ideology. Putin has presented Crimea's recovery in 2014, scare quotes recovery, as a crowning achievement. He can certainly be expected to fight very hard to retain it. This is not to say that conquering Crimea is likely to be impossible for Ukraine, but military history suggests that it would likely be a very costly and difficult exercise and would have a high risk of exhausting Ukraine's military resources. So that's a really interesting set of threads on Crimea, and I would broadly agree, or I completely agree. In fact, I would go a little bit further. I am pretty adamant that it would be suicidal. That you just, I don't think an attack on Crimea is doable. I think Crimea, you can only take Crimea by basically shutting it off, doing a let's get the map out again. I mean, I've said this many times. You know what I'm going to say. Those of you that have been following my videos. So we go back to the map of Ukraine and imagine that the Ukrainians are going to do what I keep saying that they will probably do, which is some kind of counteroffensive down to the Sea of Azov coastline, and then effectively take back all of this by cutting that off from supply, or indeed all of this, cutting it off from supply and then squeezing the Russians until the Russians maybe retreat back to Crimea, and that the Ukrainians would have something that looks like that under their control. Then the Ukrainians are in a situation where, okay, what do we do now? Do we do a full frontal attack? And at the point of Chris O's threads, well, for me at any rate, is to suggest that any kind of frontal attack would be suicidal. It'd be ridiculous. You can absolutely hammer troops across at the Perekop Isthmus. It's a really narrow crossing point that it's very difficult to cross elsewhere. You just hammer the bridge at Chonhar, hammer the bridge at Arabat Spit, the Russians would, and then that leaves you with really a difficult entrance into Crimea, and they have put defenses in all sorts of places. That the Ukrainians don't have superiority in the air or in the sea, and so therefore any kind of support from aviation or from the navy is going to be hard to come by. and I just don't think that you'd see an attack through one isthmus. I think it would just be really, really difficult to the point of being almost impossible for the Ukrainians to attack in this direction. What you'd end up seeing is that Ukraine blocking off Crimea and then using long range munitions, whether it be positioned up here after the counteroffensive or after they squeezed out here, to then hit key points like the Kerch Bridge, like Sevastopol, Simferopol, Jankoy. And if you just absolutely hammer Crimea with ordnance and missiles that do a good job, then actually it becomes untenable for the Russians to hold on to Crimea. There's no utility in Crimea because they're just getting hit. They can't resupply. They haven't got this area here. Arguably, if the Ukrainians have been successful, so that any kind of supply north of there is not needed. And so the point of Crimea is the deep water port. A warm water, deep water port. It doesn't freeze over, and that gives them access to the Black Sea, obviously, but also to the Mediterranean. But if that becomes untenable, if the Ukrainians can properly hammer this port, you've seen some of the Russian naval fleet move to Novorossiysk, and that is not ideal for the Russians because it is a shallow port and it's a commercial port, and actually they can't moor all the naval vessels they want in there, and the submarines and so on and so forth. So it's really important for the Russians that they keep Sevastopol. But if, as I said, the Ukrainians can make it untenable for the Russians to stay there, then that's the best way of taking Crimea, rather than actually sending in troops into very narrow entrance points onto the peninsula. Anyway, thank you so much, Chris O, for those threads that's given us a really good insight into the history and geography of Crimea, and whether it will be worth the Ukrainians trying to take Crimea by force, by a land attack from the north, whether they can learn from history, whether they can improve on history, or whether the same problems will exist. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate you supporting all the work I do. Thank you to all the members. Thank you to all the people on Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal. I'll give out an explicit thanks tomorrow to those people. Anyway, till the pips, catch you later.